Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. In today's session, we are going to start yet another novel that is included in your course, that is Tess of Durbervilles, and that is written by Thomas Hardy. Well, in today's session, I would give you an introduction to Hardy, the writer of the novel, and the novel itself. However, before I go into the details of today's session, I would like to share a quick review of the previous session. Previous session was the last session on Great Expectations. We started our course with Joseph Andrews, if you remember. Then we shifted on to we moved on to the next novel, that was Emma. We covered Emma, written by Jane Austen. Our third novel that we covered was Great Expectations, and actually in the previous session we completed Great Expectations. Now we are moving to the final novel included in this course. At the outset of the session, I would like to share the scheme of presentation of this novel, that is Tess of Durbervilles. As I have already said, that we would study the novel Tess of Durbervilles in our course as the last novel of the course. We will start with an introduction to the novelist, that is Thomas Hardy, and then the novel Tess would be given an introduction. Since the novel is divided into phases, in each of the upcoming sessions I would cover one phase of the novel, thus covering one phase of the life of Tess. As far as today's session is concerned, well, today I would introduce you to the writer of the novel, that is Thomas Hardy, who is the author of the novel that we are going to study. We would talk about his birth and early education, his career, his works, that is the novels and the poetry, his influence on the development of novel and on other authors. And with this we would move on to the introduction to the novel that you're going to study, that is Tess of Durbervilles. And when I would come to the introduction of the novel, I would talk about genre of the novel, setting of this novel, times and religion with reference to Hardy and his novel, that is the novel selected, Tess, themes of the novel, and important characters in the novel would also be introduced in today's session, so that when later on you go through the text, it is easy for you to understand who is who and what happens. So let's start with an introduction to the author, that is Thomas Hardy. About the author and his early life, I would say that Hardy was born on June 2, 1840 in Higher Bockhampton in Dorset, and Dorset is a rural region of southwestern England. His father was a stonemason and a violinist, and he spent his early years in rural surroundings. As far as his mother is concerned, she was a housewife who enjoyed reading and telling stories and folk songs to her children. From his family, Hardy gained the interests that would influence his life and appear in his novels. Architecture and music both would come in from the parents, of course architecture from the father and music from both, the lifestyles of the country folk and literature itself. Later on, the same area became focus of his fiction, the area where he was born and he was brought up through the early years of his life. Hardy attended Julia Martin's school in Bockhampton for his early education, and early from the age of 8 to 16 actually he studied there. However, most of his education was informal and independent. It came from the books he found in Dorchester, the nearby town. He taught himself French, German and Latin. It was at the age of 16 that Hardy's father apprenticed him to a local architect, John Hicks, and under Hicks's guidance, Hardy learned about architectural drawing and the restoration of old houses and churches. Well, Hardy was very much interested in this work as an architect. Why? For the reason that he enjoyed the opportunity that was provided to him through this profession to study the histories of the houses and the families that lived there. Talking more about the early education of Hardy, I would say though he was working, he continued his studies. Hardy studied with the Greek scholar Horace Mall during this period of his life, and it was in 1862 that Hardy was sent to London to work with the architect Arthur Bloomfield. During his 5 years in London, Hardy learned a lot. Hardy immersed himself in the cultural scene by visiting museums and theatres and studying classical literature. He even began to write his own poetry. So the first thing we notice about his career as a writer is that he started with poetry. Although he did not remain in London, choosing instead to return to Dorchester as a church restorer, he maintained his newfound talent for writing. So simultaneously his career as a writer and his career as an architect would go on. He returned to Dorchester where he worked as an architect to restore a church, but the talent that he had discovered in himself of writing, that also flourished. The child of a builder, Hardy was apprenticed at the age of 16 to John Hicks, an architect who lived in the city of Dorchester, and the location would later serve as the model for Hardy's fictional Casterbridge. So actually when you would go through Tess, you would see, like all other novels in Tess also, Hardy has used his knowledge of the kind of surroundings, the geographical background in which he lived, all that knowledge he has used to create the fictional geographical lands where the settings of his novels are created and set. With this we come to the beginning of Hardy's career as a novelist. Although he gave serious thought to attending university and entering the church, a struggle he would dramatize in his novel Jude the Obscure. If you ever get hold of the novel and read it, you would really understand what I mean by this here. Anyhow, so he dramatized it later in Jude the Obscure. Declining religious faith and lack of money led Hardy to pursue a career in writing instead. It took him quite a number of years to establish his careers. To establish your career as a writer is not easy for everybody. For most of the people it proves to be a hard task, and same was the case with Hardy. It took him quite a number of years to establish himself in writing. For the initial years he produced only successful novels and poetry. In fact, from 1867 Hardy wrote poetry and novels both, though the first part of his career was devoted mostly to novels. The sole purpose of writing novels at that time point was to earn money, whereas poetry was his real passion. At first he published anonymously, as many writers do, but after he started gaining popularity, he began to use his own name. As many writers at that time published their works in periodicals and magazines like the work of his contemporaries such as Charles Dickens, so Hardy's novels were also published serially in magazines, and they became popular in both England and America. His work reflects the conventions of serialization. When I was talking about Dickens and when we were studying Great Expectations with reference to Dickens, I discussed in detail that when a writer is writing in a magazine in form of episodes, the interest of the reader is to be retained, so the writer has to follow certain conventions, certain techniques to generate interest of the reader, to create some suspense, and to make the reader buy the next installment or the next magazine. So when it comes to Hardy, he also followed all those conventions of serialization. So each episode would end up at a point that would create some curiosity in the readers to know what happened next. So to generate the interest of the readers and to ensure that readers would buy a serialized novels, writers often use certain techniques to create suspense. As I have said earlier, the same we notice in Hardy's many works, and when you would go through Tess, you would see after every say 20, 30 or 15 pages, every time when a chapter or a part or an episode would be moving towards its end, something would be raised that would generate suspense to know what happened next. Moving towards Hardy's famous novels, his first popular novel was Under the Greenwood Tree, that was published in 1872. The next great novel, Far from the Madding Crowd, published in 1874, it was actually the author's first critical and financial success. It was so popular that the prophets allowed Hardy to give up his career as architecture, and he decided to marry Emma Gifford as well, and it provided a kind of stability to his financial part of his life. His other popular novels include Return of the Native, The Mayor of Casterbridge, Tess of Durbervilles, Jude the Obscure, and A Pair of Blue Eyes. At this time point, I would also like to talk about Hardy's choices in terms of poetry and novels. Although Hardy built a reputation as a successful novelist, Hardy himself considered himself as a poet, and he thought that first and foremost he was a poet. Poetry he enjoyed as it was his passion. To him, novels were primarily a means of earning a living. So Hardy published 3 collections of short stories and 5 shorter novels, all moderately successful. However, despite the praise Hardy's fiction received, many critics criticized his work on the basis of the projection of violence and sexual content included in his works. For instance, Tess of the Durbervilles and Jude the Obscure are criticized by many on these accounts. The outcry against Jude or Jude the Obscure, if I go for the full name, was so great that Hardy decided to stop writing novels, and he decided to return to his first great love, that is poetry. And finally it was in 1898 that his dream of becoming a poet was realized with the publication of his collection that was titled as Wessex Poems. He then turned his attentions to an epic drama in verse, The Dynasts. It was finally completed in 1908. Before his death, he had written over 800 poems, many of which were published while he was in his 80s. So, starting his career with poetry and ending his career as his life ended with poetry, Hardy tried various genres within literature. He wrote epic drama, he wrote novels, he wrote short stories. Some of them were moderately successful, some of them were very successful. However, it was after his death that he is considered to be one of the great novelists of English literature. Dear students, I think it would not be a bad idea to give you some information on the personal life of Hardy, because this information always helps understanding the writing and the writing style of a writer. As far as personal life of Hardy is concerned, he finally got his personal life settled and happy. This happened quite late in his life. Though, as I have already told you, after the success in writing novels, he gave up his career as an architect and he got married to Emma. However, it was not a very happy marriage, and despite his first marriage to Emma in 1874, he could not have real personal happy life. It was in 1912 that his first wife Emma died. Although their marriage had not been very happy, Hardy grieved at her sudden death. It was in 1914 he married Florence Dugdale, and she was extremely devoted to him, and this was the beginning of his happy life that continued through his life till the end. When it comes to Hardy's achievements, the last 2 decades of Hardy's life brought him fame, and he achieved a lot of appreciation. He achieved a level of fame that was equal to that of Dickens, his contemporary, and it was in 1910 that he was awarded the Order of Merit. There was renewed interest of readers in his novels, and as a result of this increased popularity, Max Gate became a literary shrine and a tourist attraction as well. This leads us to the death of Thomas Hardy. After a long and highly successful career, Thomas Hardy died on January 11, 1928 at the age of 87. His ashes were buried in Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey. After his death, Florence, his second wife, published Hardy's autobiography in 2 parts under her own name. Hardy left many of his possessions to the nation. Amongst these are the pens that Hardy had used to write his various works. He personally engraved each of them with the name of the text it was used to write. Now that we have quite enough knowledge about Hardy's birth, his early life, education and career till his death, I would say this is the time when it is important for us to explore Hardy's art as a novelist. Well, Hardy cannot be solely labelled as a Victorian novelist. He cannot be even categorized simply as a modernist. He cannot be categorized as a modernist in the tradition of writers such as Virginia Woolf or D.H. Lawrence, who built a new kind of novel in its place. Unlike them, Hardy did not completely break away from the conventions of 19th century literature that he followed. Actually, Hardy falls somewhere on middle ground between the 19th and 20th century literature. His work is a beautiful combination of Victorian sensibilities and more modern trends in writing, especially in novel. Hardy had to face a lot of criticism for his novels, but he is acknowledged as one of the great English novelists since his death. He paved way for modern novel, and it would not be unjustified to say that he was an important influence on modernism, and many later writers including Virginia Woolf, D.H. Lawrence and Robert Graves, they were inspired by his works. As far as his poetry is concerned, it too has generated same kind of influence. It is quite non-romantic in the sense that it deals with the themes more of real life and more of the bitter realities of real life as his novels do. Dear students, when we look at the work of 20th century, we notice that several classic composers including Gustav Holst and Benjamin Britten, they set Hardy's poems to music. When it comes to the adaptation of his novels for movies during his lifetime, Hardy was frequently asked to allow his texts to be adapted for the emerging medium of film. He could understand a film's promotional benefits and the possibilities of widening the range of his audience through this medium, so he agreed to it. However, early attempts at filming his work were quite dissatisfactory, and despite Hardy's involvement in the process, they could not meet a huge success. Later on, from time to time, films are based on his various works, and they have been quite successful. With this, we move on to the particular novel, Tess of the Durbervilles, that we are going to explore in this course. Tess of the Durbervilles was published in 1891. It got popular immediately after its publication. Its sales assured Hardy's financial future. However, the novel received a lot of criticism as well. It aroused a substantial amount of controversy, and it was because of, as I have talked earlier, because of criticism on the society that he laid, especially the upper class, the urban class, and because of the sexual contents that critics said were found in his novels. In Tess of the Durbervilles and other novels, Hardy demonstrates his deep sense of moral sympathy for England's lower classes, particularly for rural women. Tess is presented as a lower class working woman who endures a lot of hardships in her life. In the case of Tess also, we notice that the sympathies that Hardy had with the lower class working women, they are clearly reflected throughout the novel, as most of the women who are presented, they belong to this class, and their problems, especially the financial problems that they face, they are dealt with in a very, very sensitive way. Well, there was a lot of criticism on Hardy's novels, including Tess of the Durbervilles. Hardy became famous for his compassionate and often controversial portrayal of young women victimized by the self-righteous rigidity of English social morality. In the case of Tess also, we see how a young woman becomes a victim of fate and the cruelty of men. In fact, perhaps his most famous depiction of such a young woman is in Tess of the Durbervilles. As you would go through the novel, you would see it. It is this frank and critical projection of the hypocrisy of English society of Hardy's time, especially of the upper class, that was objected to by the people of his own times because they felt threatened by all this. When it comes to criticism on Tess of the Durbervilles, a lot of criticism was laid by the conservative and status-conscious British readers on Hardy's works. Hardy lived and wrote during a time when a rapid social change was taking over England. The transition from an old-fashioned agricultural nation to a modern industrial society brought a lot of socio-economic issues with it. Now that the social setup was changing, now the financial setup was changing, the values associated with this social setup were also changing. Businessmen, entrepreneurs, and new money holders joined the ranks of the social elite. This disturbed the social queue. Dear students, what I feel is that if you relate it to our own society, you would notice वो जो एक हम कहते हैं ना जद्दी पुश्ती रईस होना, जद्दी पुश्ती अमीर होना, जद्दी पुश्ती किसी बड़े ख़ानदान से ताल्लुक़ होना, नस्ब और ये सब कुछ. In comparison to that, जो नौ दौलती है, all the people with the easily earned money or with the new money, the recently earned money, they challenge the elitedom of the class that I've already talked about, और वो भी अपने आप को समझते हैं कि वो उनका रुतबा और उनका ख़ानदान बड़ा है. So exactly the same was happening in the society where Hardy lived in England during his times. He saw all that happening there. So when all this was happening, of course the social queue was disturbed. This also led to the fading away of the old class system, bringing many ancient aristocratic families and old money holders to socio-economic disgrace. In Tess of the Durbervilles, at the very outset we see the family of Tess facing the same crisis. पुराने ज़मानों में वो अमीर हुआ करते थे, उनके आबाओ अजदाद अमीर हुआ करते थे. Now they are living in extreme poverty. Tess's parents, the Durbervilles, lose themselves in the fantasy of belonging to an ancient and aristocratic family, the Durbervilles. Hardy's novel strongly suggests that such a family history is not only meaningless but also utterly undesirable because it brings suffering only. Hardy criticizes such views on the subject that were found threatening by the conservative class. The criticism was so harsh that Hardy was frustrated by the controversy caused by his works, and he finally decided to leave novel writing after Jude the Obscure, that he wrote actually after Tess. For the rest of his life he only wrote poetry. With this we come to the direct exploration of the novel Tess of the Durbervilles, and I would like to start with the genre. As far as genre is concerned, Tess of Durbervilles can be placed in the category of tragedy and pastoral. Tragedy typically tells the story of a great or important protagonist whose ambition causes his or her fall from happiness. When we apply this definition to Tess, it does not fit very well. Tess is not very ambitious. In fact, it is her parents who are. Well, at this time point, those who have not yet started reading the text, I would like to make it clear that Tess is the name of the protagonist, the female protagonist in the story, the young girl whose story it is, and the same is the title of the novel. So don't get confused with this. So Tess is also not a great person at the start of the novel. She is just a country girl with a little education, having good looks, but not extraordinarily beautiful. This is what Hardy tells us as he writes. However, the fall is applicable to her in the sense that her family was great once. The forefathers were great people, were rich people. At the outset of the novel, we are told that they descended from the Durbervilles, an ancient aristocratic family. However, through the times, they have fallen to a low socio-economic condition. And as you would go to the next session and you would look at the first chapter of the novel, where we would start with phase 1, you would see that the story starts from a point where Tess, as a young girl, is living in very poor and low socio-economic conditions. Anyhow, it is not a tragedy in the traditional sense of the word, but it is a tragedy because it shows the suffering and the fall of Tess, the young poor girl. As far as a pastoral story is concerned, a pastoral just means that it portrays the country, the countryside, the rural life, as opposed to the city life or the city scenes in an idealized or romantic way. Most of the bad stuff that happens to Tess in the novel, it is a result of modernization and civilization, and not from anything that would have originated in the country. The countryside proves to be safe for her, and she is protected and is not threatened. It is either the city life or the people from the city life who bring her suffering. So in that sense, because mainly the novel is set in the rural context, and the happenings that take place, they take place in the rural context, we can call it a pastoral as well. With this, we move on to the setting of the novel Tess of the Durbervilles. In Tess of the Durbervilles, action takes place in Wessex County. It is actually situated in England, and the Victorian era is presented. Late 19th century is a time period of the reign of Queen Victoria, who ruled from 1837 to 1901, and the times are projected. The area that is depicted is of England to the southwest of London, and almost all of Hardy's novels take place in this same general area. The towns he mentions in the novel Tess might appear in other novels as well, but they are all fictionalized versions of that real region of England. Hardy called his fictionalized version of this area Wessex, so his novels that take place there are sometimes referred to as the Wessex novels. I have already referred to his collection of poetry while I was sharing his life story with you, and again there this term Wessex was used. So the familiar backgrounds that he has fictionalized are given a name, and he repeatedly uses it in his works, be the novels or poetry. Tess's childhood home of Marlott, that is also in the country of Wessex, in the county of Wessex, is the Vale of Blakemore or Blackmore. Now please notice the spellings and the pronunciation, Blakemore and Blackmore. Hardy repeatedly refers to the area by using both of these versions of its name. Sometimes during the novel, in the text, Blakemore is used, sometimes Blackmore is used. It is a fictional valley, but Hardy continuously reminds us that there are two accepted pronunciations of the name. In fact, Blakemore is the older version of Blackmore. The word Blake was used in Middle English for black, and Moor was the old spelling of Moor, so it just shows a kind of shift. Keeping this explanation in mind, maybe we can conclude that Hardy wants probably to remind us how much history there is in the place. Well, while we are discussing the setting of the novel Tess, I think it is important to discuss the role of nature as a part of the setting. Usually the role of setting is limited in a piece of fiction. However, when it comes to Tess of the Durbervilles, we can look at the setting of the novel as crucial to all the happenings. Nature, the setting of the novel, is almost a main character in the novel. Hardy uses setting and environment in Tess, the novel, to give actions a certain direction. Tess of the Durbervilles takes place in Wessex, a region of the southern English county of Dorset, and neighbouring counties such as Hampshire, Wiltshire, Somerset and Devon. The setting consists of more than the location, however, particularly in this novel. Nature as a part of the setting is an essential element in understanding the novel. Actually, the whole action of the novel takes place in the rural setting, and Hardy has then used a lot of symbols taken from nature to explain, to give, to hint at, to refer to what he wanted to convey. Well, it is also important that the countryside and the people who live there not only provide a backdrop for the action of the story, but also lead and direct the action. In Tess of the Durbervilles, the characters and setting actually they mirror each other. A lot of the misery of Tess is reflected through symbols of nature, and the setting of the nature reinforces actually, on the other hand, what happens to Tess. How we can look at it is happiness and love is equal to green, lovely environment. Toil, labor and hard work are equal to barren land. So what happens is, with the change in what happens to Tess, with the change in the nature of sufferings that she has, and with the change in the phase of her life that brings her either happiness or love or toil, labor and hard work, we would see a lot of change in the background setting that is always taken from nature. So when Tess is happy and she finds love in life, the whole background is of the lovely green, lush, beautiful natural setting. When she is passing through the phases of hard work, toil, labor and suffering, we would find dull images, we would see barren land as a setting to further intensify what Hardy wants to convey to the readers. Anyhow, continuing with setting in the novel Tess of the Durbervilles and the role of nature, I would say that the two main farms, that is Talbothays and Flintcombe Ash, these are the two farms where Tess spent a lot of time of her life and worked there. They represent the best and worst of farm life. They represent the best and worst of the phases of the life of Tess as well. The farm is the only world that Tess knows. She has a very limited exposure, she has a very limited life. She never travels more than 50 miles from her place of birth. बस वही 50 कोई मील के एरिया में उसकी पूरी जिंदगी जो है ना वहीं पर चक्कर खाते हुए गुजरती है. The whole of the work is rurally set, and with the level of detail that it is set, we can say that Hardy's intimate knowledge of the inner workings of a 19th century farm. Because Hardy lived in that kind of background, he worked in that kind of background, so he knows the details of all that, and he has incorporated those details in his work. The result is that the settings that he creates, they become more realistic and more natural. In fact, in the whole novel, there is very little evidence of machinery, and animals are a means of transportation. It is rarely that some modern life is projected, and though I would say there are some instances of the projection of this modern life. For example, twice it is projected with reference to some machines. We notice modern machines in the novel. For example, the train delivering the Talbothays milk to London, on which later on when you would read the novel you would see Tess goes there with the angel and they deliver milk, and the threshing machine used at Flintcombe Ash, where the harvest is being done by using modern machinery. And apart from these two instances of the references to machines, the rest of the setting is purely rural, conventional, conservative and natural. With this we come to the title of the novel, Tess of the Durbervilles. Tess of the Durbervilles is the name of the heroine of the novel, if we can call her a heroine. From Tess Durberville to Tess of the Durberville, the novel shows a complete journey. Well, at this point I would like to make it very, very clear that we are told that Tess has the surname Durberville, and Tess Durberville is introduced in the very beginning of the novel as the young girl round whom the whole novel would revolve. However, simultaneously it is told that her father discovers his ancestors and the grandeur related to his ancestors, and comes to know accidentally or incidentally that his lineage goes to, or it belongs to, a famous family, Durbervilles in the history, the family of knights. So sometimes she is called Tess Durberville and sometimes Tess of the Durbervilles. And actually it is her parents' desire for making her Tess of the Durbervilles instead of Tess Durberville that brings all her sufferings. And then from Tess of the Durbervilles that she wants to be, she inspires to be, her journey back to the common life of Tess Durberville. This is the whole story of the novel. Well, initially when the novel was published, it was given the name Tess of the Durbervilles, and there was no subtitle. बस इतना ही title था. फिर उसके बाद later on, as I have already said, that the novel initially was published as episodes in magazine. So later on, when Hardy decided to give it as a complete volume, he added a subtitle to the name. The subtitle of the novel could use some more attention to a pure woman. This was added. So finally, when the volume was published as a complete full version of the novel, Tess of the Durberville, a pure woman. This a pure woman was used as a subtitle in the name or the title of the novel. That was initially not a part of the original manuscript, and even not a part of the initial publication in the graphic magazine when it was published in episodes. Why it was done? Okay, Hardy was revising the novel for its publication as a single volume in 1891. And since by that time when it was published in graphic magazine, there was a lot of criticism that was laid against the novel and the character of Tess, so Hardy felt the need to defend his heroine and her inherent purity, so he added the subtitle A Pure Woman, a woman, to assert that his concept of morality and his concept of purity or his concept of innocence is completely different from the conservative traditional concept of purity of a woman. With this, I would bring you to the writing style of Hardy in general, and especially or specifically Hardy's writing style with reference to Tess of the Durberville. Actually, it is just a small, brief introduction to his writing style. When you would go through the text, as we would explore the text through the sessions, you would see how this writing style is manifest in what he has produced. Anyhow, as far as his writing style in general is concerned, it is a pessimistic writing style, and it is very much reflected in Tess of the Durbervilles. This writing style is created to suit the themes, maybe, the ideas that he presents, the issues that he deals with, and actually he uses his symbols, his images to create this pessimism. It also reflects his personal sense of the inevitable tragedy that is human life. According to Hardy, life was nothing but suffering, and this is very much reflected in his writing style as well. When it comes to diction, his choice of words, his sentences, I would say his diction, his choice of words is very simple. His sentences are also very simple. You would see that as he deals with the lives of simple rural people, he uses simple language, small, brief sentences to convey what he wants to convey about them. So the simple sentences match the simple nature of the characters about whom they are written. These brief sentences make the reading fluent and easy as well. This style suits his characters as well as the rural backdrop in which he has set all his novels, and especially Tess of the Durbervilles, as we are concerned with it right now. However, it does not mean that he did not write complicated or complex sentences. Actually, we see a variation from simple to complex sentences in his writing. When the situations are complex and complicated, when the issue at hand is complex and complicated, when the environment that he presents is complex and complicated, he uses complex sentences. When the things that he presents, the characters that he represents, they are simple, he uses simple language, and this shows his mastery over his writing style. With this, we come to the themes of the novel Tess of the Durbervilles. Well, as you would go through the novel, you would see a lot of themes emerging from the text. I would discuss different selected parts of the text with reference to certain themes. I would point out those parts of the text that support certain themes. However, before we really start exploring the text, I think it is a good idea to introduce you to some general themes of his work that would recurrently occur in his work. The first and the foremost theme that occurs in Tess of the Durbervilles is inevitable suffering. Tess की कहानी, पूरी कहानी suffering की कहानी है. It is the story of human effort to survive. It is the story of inevitable suffering, and it is the story of loss. The second important theme, don't worry, I would explore these themes in detail जब हम अगले वाले sessions पे जाएंगे. अभी I just want to introduce थोड़ा सा एक बुनियादी बातें बताना चाहती हूँ so that you are prepared for exploring the novel itself. Anyhow, the second important theme is of the permanence of sin. Well, Tess would commit a sin. Then she would try to rectify. Would she be able to or not? This sin would not leave her. And again, the argument remains there whether she sinned or she was sinned against. So, permanence of sin, that the sin that somebody commits is there forever as a blob on the character of that person and is always there as a mark of shame. This is one of the themes of Tess of the Durbervilles. The third important theme that Hardy has brought into projection is of social class. Well, social class as a general theme you would find in the works of almost all the novels of almost all the novelists, if not all, many of the novels or many of the novelists. However, when it comes to Hardy, his projection of social class is very, very important with reference to the social class distinction that brought suffering to the lower class people in general, that brought suffering to the lower class women, the rural lower class working women in special. Hardy, being sensitive to what was happening through his times and being sensible enough to foresee what was going to happen in future, has presented the theme of changing ideas of social class in Victorian England. वो जो अभी आपसे मैंने पहले बात की थी ना, that the old money holders and the new money holders, they come in clash. The issues of elitism, the issues of nobility, the disturbance of the social queue, all these are the areas that he has discussed when it comes to presenting themes embedded in the text of the novel. As I have said earlier, that social change was taking place, and the change was being brought because of the shift from the agricultural society to a more modernized and to more business-oriented society, to a more what I would say industry-based society. So economic issues were emerging, and as far as Hardy is concerned, in Tess of the Durbervilles, he presents the theme of economic repression. You would see that the female protagonist of the story of the novel, Tess, throughout her life, as it is presented in the novel, struggles for economic stability. It is because of the economic repression, it is because of the economic pressures, and because of her need to financially support her family, that she falls a victim to what she suffers throughout the novel. Well, dear students, fate, or the role of fate, is yet another important theme that runs throughout the text of the novel Tess of the Durbervilles. And when it comes to fate, actually Hardy believes that human beings cannot get rid of fate. What has to happen has to happen. Chances are created for that, situations are created for that to take place. In the novel, you would see that Tess is a victim of fate. It is just by chance that certain things happen that lead towards all that she suffers. A few more themes related to the novel Tess are of male dominance, of sense of responsibility, and of sense of guilt that I would like to talk about one by one. As far as male dominance is concerned, well, for Hardy to present a society where rural women are presented as victims, as sufferers, and as the oppressed ones, when he presents all this, of course he presents male dominance. In the society where he lived, men were in control of women, men were in financial control, men were in the social control of the lives of women. A very interesting theme that emerges right from the beginning of the novel is that of sense of responsibility. It is out of Tess's sense of responsibility towards her family, towards her sense of responsibility towards the financial support of her siblings and her parents, that she suffers. It is for this purpose that she leaves home. It is for this purpose that she suffers. She is victimized, and it is for the same purpose that even after being victimized and going through sufferings of her personal life, she comes back to the family when again she comes to know that they need her badly, that they are in again a crisis. The last theme that I would like to point out so far is of guilt. Well, as you would go through the novel, you would see what happens to Tess, whether she sins or you believe she is sinned against. Anyways, she is guilty about that. She tries to help her family, she is unable to do that. She is guilty about that. When it comes to her love relationship with somebody, the male protagonist in the story, again she feels guilty about her past. So the theme of guilt goes, it runs throughout the novel, and the thread of guilt as one of the recurrent themes you would notice throughout the novel Tess. Well, I think it would not be out of context to talk about Hardy's concept of religion and his concept of society at this time point. Why it is important? Because it would help you understand what is presented in the novel Tess. Hardy was against the traditional conservative view of religion. So Hardy's works in general and Tess in specific is a criticism on religion and the norms and values of conservative religious people. Hardy's works in general and Tess in special is also an expression of doubts about religion. You would see that the male protagonist in the male central character in the novel, would be a mouthpiece of Hardy to express doubts about religion and religious values and norms. We find Hardy challenging religious practices in Tess of the Durbervilles, and he presents a non-conservative view of religion. Later on, when you would go through the novel, there would be quite a few instances where, for example, Tess would be baptizing her child, where, for example, Angel would be questioning his father, that you would see the non-conservative view of religion reflected there. We find Hardy mocking at the conservative religious practices through all that he has presented. He also exposes the superficiality of the knowledge of religion towards the end of the novel. When we come to that point, I would explain in detail. So far it is enough for you to know that towards the end of the novel, the antagonist, the central male character, who is in the role of a villain, I would say, he converts to a strongly religious person, and Hardy has exposed his superficiality of knowledge when it comes to an episode of going to a cross, and he asks Tess to swear in the name of that cross, whereas he doesn't know the cross is not a Christian cross. So the role of clergymen and the role of religious people and the superficiality of their knowledge and their practices is actually what Hardy has presented in Tess, the novel, and these are the things that were criticized by the people of his times. Dear students, before we move towards the end of today's session, I would like you to be introduced to the main characters or some important characters of the novel Tess of the Durbervilles, because it would help you understand as you would go through the text. The central female character, the protagonist of the novel, is Tess Durbervilles or Tess of the Durbervilles. I have already talked in detail about these two different names and the reasons of all this. Well, who is she? She is the female protagonist. As far as calling her a heroine or the heroine of this novel is concerned, well, we really doubt that, because we don't see anything attractive, anything idealized as such in terms of being the heroine, so it is very difficult to call her a heroine. Well, anyhow, she is beautiful. As we would start exploring the text, you would come to know she is quite ordinary in her looks, but she has a kind of attraction that makes her beautiful. With her large eyes, she can be called beautiful. The more she would suffer, however, the more we would find references to her beauty as Hardy would present her, which is also very ironic. She is loyal. We would find her loyal to her family, to her parents and her siblings, the sense of responsibility that she feels towards them. We would find her loyal towards Angel, her husband. Later on in the story, you would see that despite the way Angel treats her, she remains loyal to him till the very end of the novel, where finally something happens that I would not like to reveal here, and this loyalty is challenged. Well, when the novel starts, she is young, she is poor, financial crisis is there. She is responsible enough to consider the critical situation and to take the initiative to try to sort it out. You would see in the very first few chapters, she is committed to the family and she lives with her family in the village of Marlet, from where the story begins. The second most important character in the novel is of Angel Clare. Well, Angel is a male protagonist. You may call him the hero of the novel if you can. He is an intelligent young man and he doesn't want to be a clergyman. His father actually is a clergyman. He has two more brothers and both of those brothers are also clergymen. But he doesn't want to be a clergyman, and if you remember, I just a few minutes ago I said that Hardy expresses his doubts about religion in the novel. So this is Angel, who becomes a mouthpiece to express all those doubts. Anyhow, he wants to be a farmer and he wants to preserve his intellectual freedom from the pressures of city life. He doubts certain religious matters and he questions his father on that, and that is why he doesn't want to be a clergyman like the rest of the male members of his family. He meets Tess when she is a milkmaid at Talbot's dairy and quickly falls in love with her, and from there the story of the two goes on. The third important character in the story is of Alec. He is the antagonist. He is the villain of the story, I would say. Well, he is attractive, he is handsome, but he is immoral. He is the son of a wealthy merchant and he is not really a Durberville, as his father simply took on the name of the ancient noble family after he built his mansion and retired. So, the theme that I said of new money and old money is exhibited through his taking on the name Durbervilles that he and his family took on. He is a very, very manipulative kind of a person and he uses money to have power. We would see him exploiting situations repeatedly. Well, the three characters that I have introduced so far, that is Tess, Angel and Alec, they make a triangle and most of the action in the novel revolves around these three characters. If I say that the story of Tess is the story that moves around these three characters, it would not be unfair to say that. However, there are many other characters who contribute towards the development of the plot and to give form and shape to the story. I would like to introduce some of important characters before we really start exploring the text itself. Here on this slide, I am introducing Mr. John Durberville and Mrs. John Durberville. Mr. John Durberville is the father of Tess. Well, he is a lazy person, he is a daydreamer, he is a peddler in Marlotte, so on his horse cart he sells things. He takes pride in his family background, and at the very outset of the novel you would see that he comes to know about his lineage, the ancient lineage that he has, and his family's connections with the knights in the past, as his ancestors as very, very rich and respectable people of the past. He starts taking pride in this background and he starts daydreaming about all that, forgetting the reality of his life. To what happens to, in terms of what happens to Tess and in terms of how much she suffers, I would say yes, Mr. John Durberville plays a very, very important role, because her suffering started as a result of Mr. John Durberville's attitude towards life. When it comes to Tess's mother, well, Joan Durberville is Tess's mother. She is a simple-minded woman. By the way, this is simple-minded. You can put a simple small dash here and or separate these words. She's a simple-minded woman in the sense that she doesn't go into the intricacies or complexities of ideas. She has a few aims or objectives in life, and to achieve them she thinks simply and straight she focuses on those. However, she is of forgiving nature. Whensoever Tess does not agree to what she wants her to do, she gets angry, but later on she forgives very soon, very quickly. She is unable to understand the intricacies of situations. Well, she can also be blamed for what happens to Tess. Later on, you would see Tess herself blaming her mother for not telling her a lot. She is also not very responsible. In fact, both the father and mother of Tess, they are not responsible people. Had they have that sense of responsibility, maybe Tess would not have to suffer that much. However, Mrs. Joan Durberville is wise in some worldly ways. Later on in the novel, when Tess is going to get married to Angel, she writes a letter to seek the advice of her mother. And in the worldly way, she gives her the very right advice to you see, not reveal, to hide the bitter realities of her life from Angel. Another character who appears on the scene for just a short while in the novel is of Mrs. Durberville. She is the mother of Alec, the villain of the story, I would say. She is the widow of Simpson Stokes. She is blind. She is not very well and she is often ill. She has a lot of love for animals. She has a lot of birds that she takes care of, and she actually, for this purpose, when for the first time Tess goes there, she has to take care of her birds, and because she is blind and because she is ill and because she has a superficial view and she doesn't think of Tess much, maybe that is the point from where her tragedy starts. So far I have introduced the parents of the heroine, that is the female protagonist Tess, and of what you may call the villain, that is Alec. Now I am going to introduce the parents of Angel. Reverend Clare is the clergyman, the father of Angel. He is a clergyman in the town of Amminster, and he is focused on converting people. He is very strict and very much principled. He is very conservative in nature, and through his personality and his actions, actually Hardy has criticized, or he has brought to light, what he disliked in the conservative traditional religious setup and the religious values. When it comes to the mother of Angel, she is Mrs. Clares. She is not as such involved much into the happenings in the novel, but what we come to know about her is that she loves her son. Well, she is very snobbish. She belongs to the upper class, and for example, when Tess would send some wine and some other stuff, some pudding for Mrs. Clare and her family, she very snobbishly criticizes that and gives it to poor people. However, she is very reasonable in many ways, and though she initially criticizes Angel's interest in Tess, however later on she accepts her, and we would see that she always has a positive view regarding Tess and the relationship of Angel and Tess. Well, with this we come to the end of today's session. Before I close, I would just say that the references of the materials that are used for this novel, they would be provided at the end of the sessions that are related to this novel. A list would be provided there along with a list of the materials that are given for reading from certain sources. With this, I come to a quick review of the current session. Well, today's session was very important in the sense that we started yet another novel, that is Tess of the Durbervilles, and I introduced you to the writer of the novel, the author, that is Thomas Hardy. We talked about his birth and his early education. I also provided you some information regarding his career, that he started as a poet and then he tried different genres of literature, and finally he reverted back to poetry when there was a lot of criticism on his novels. However, today I said he is more known as a novelist than as a poet, though he himself thought that he was first and foremost a poet. I introduced you to some important novels written by him. I talked of him in terms of his influence on the other authors, how he is a connection between the Victorian and the modern novel, and how he linked these two what I would say types of novels in one, thus continuing or thus assuring the connectivity of the Victorian novel to the modern novel that was later on written by Virginia Woolf and D.H. Lawrence, etc. With this I came to the introduction that I gave to you on the novel specifically that we're going to deal with, that is Tess of the Durbervilles. I talked about genre of the novel, that it can be called a tragedy and a pastoral as well. I justified why. I also talked about the setting of the novel. I told the places, the fictional geographical areas that are created or designed by Hardy to provide a setting for the novel. I also talked about the role of nature in the setting of the novel and how it almost becomes a character. I talked about times and religion with reference to Hardy and his novel, his views on religion and his views on the changing times, the financial and social aspects of the changing times, and how they are reflected in the novel. Then I introduced some of the important themes. I briefly discussed each of the themes. And finally, I gave you introduction to the important characters of the novel. Well, the purpose of today's session was to prepare you to read the novel Tess. I hope that you would read the novel, the text of the novel independently. It is very crucial and very important for you that you read the text, because it gives you the real flavor of the writing style and the intricacies that cannot be understood without that. As a matter of fact, as we would move on from here onwards, I would include a lot of extracts of text from the novel in the upcoming sessions. So with this, I close today's session and I say goodbye. Thank you very much.